Go ahead, she said, loud enough for half the gas station to hear, one manicured finger pointing straight at me. Call the police. I already did. The smell of fresh gasoline hung in the late afternoon air, sharp and metallic, mixing with the faint hum of traffic rolling down Highway 41 about 100 yards away. The pump beside her white Lexus SUV clicked quietly as the numbers climbed. $47.12, $47.13. The digital display glowing orange under the Texas sun. Linda Whitmore stood beside the nozzle like she owned the place, sunglasses perched on her perfectly styled blonde hair. HOA badge clipped proudly to the front of her pastel blazer like it meant something outside her gated subdivision. She had that smile, the kind that said she'd already decided how the story was going to end. Around us, 2 pickup trucks idled near the diesel pumps, their drivers watching the scene unfold with the slow curiosity of people who suddenly realized their afternoon just got interesting. I wiped my hands on an old blue shop rag and leaned against the counter outside the office door, letting the quiet settle between us. The concrete under my boots was still warm from the afternoon heat, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights from inside the station hummed steadily in the background. You filled the tank, I said calmly. You pay for the gas. That's how it works. Linda's smile tightened like a screw turning one notch too far. No, she said slowly, as if explaining basic math to a child. You charge it to the Willow Creek Estates HOA. We've already discussed this. Supporting the community is good for business. I could hear a car pulling into the lot behind me, tires crunching over gravel near the air pump. The breeze carried the smell of hot asphalt and fried food from the diner down the road. A normal day in a small Texas town. Except Linda Whitmore had decided today was the day she was going to teach the gas station owner a lesson. The problem was, she had the wrong gas station owner. See, Linda Whitmore ran her HOA like it was a tiny kingdom tucked behind stone entry gates and carefully trimmed hedges. She fined people for mailbox colors, measured grass with a ruler, once threatened a retired schoolteacher with legal action because her garden gnomes were aesthetic violations. And somewhere, along the line, she convinced herself that businesses around town should fall in line too. Free services, discounts for residents, community cooperation, she liked to call it. Most places quietly gave in just to avoid the headache. But this station wasn't most places. My name's Daniel Carter, and 3 months ago, I bought this old Shell station from my father after he retired. 40 years he ran this place, long enough that folks still remembered when the highway was 2 lanes and the nearest Walmart was 30 miles away. The sign out front still creaks a little when the wind hits it just right. I left it that way on purpose. Some things don't need fixing. What Linda Whitmore didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine standing there beside pump number 4 with her HOA clipboard tucked under her arm, was that running this gas station wasn't actually my main job. Not even close. The pump clicked again. $63.88. Her tank was nearly full. She glanced at the number, then back at me with that same smug little smile. You should really reconsider, she said, lowering her sunglasses slowly. Because the police are on their way. Right on cue, the distant sound of sirens drifted across the highway, faint at first, then clearer. 1 cruiser, maybe 2. Linda crossed her arms, satisfied, like she'd just set the final piece on a chessboard. What she didn't realize, what nobody standing there realized yet, was that she hadn't just called the police. She had just called my department. The sirens grew louder, rolling down Highway 41 like a warning echo bouncing off the storefront windows across the street. Linda Whitmore lifted her chin slightly, the way someone does when they believe they have already won the argument. Her Lexus engine ticked quietly as the metal cooled, and the pump handle rested in the cradle beside her SUV with the receipt paper fluttering faintly in the warm breeze. $63.88. She had filled every gallon, and she still had not moved a muscle toward paying for it. I could hear the low rumble of a diesel pickup idling 2 pumps over, the driver leaning his elbow out the window while pretending not to watch. Small towns are like that. People try to look busy while they listen to everything. Linda adjusted the clipboard under her arm and glanced around like she was already giving a press conference. This is what happens, she announced to no one in particular, when local businesses refuse to cooperate with the community. The word cooperate stretched out in her voice like it had quotation marks around it. I had heard the speech before. Not here, but around town. At the diner. At the hardware store. Once even outside the post office where she tried to lecture a landscaping crew about their truck blocking the HOA entrance for 6 minutes. Linda Whitmore believed two things with absolute certainty. First, that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was the most important organization in this county. Second, that she personally ran it like a mayor without the inconvenience of elections. She was 52 years old, drove that white Lexus SUV, and had been the president of that HOA for 4 straight years because nobody inside those gates wanted the job badly enough to argue with her. The sirens turned into the station entrance a moment later. 2 patrol cruisers rolled slowly across the concrete lot, tires crunching over loose gravel near the air machine before coming to a stop beside pump 3. The flashing lights painted red and blue reflections across the chrome trim on Linda's Lexus. She smiled when she saw them. Not nervous, not embarrassed, proud, like someone who had just summoned a personal security team. The driver's side door of the first cruiser opened and Officer Mark Jensen stepped out, tall, calm, the same way he always moved during traffic stops. His partner, Officer Rachel Torres, stepped out of the passenger side and glanced around the station with a quick professional sweep of the scene. Neither of them looked surprised. They both recognized the gas station immediately. Most people in town did. The old Shell sign, the faded red canopy, the wooden bench outside the office door where my father used to drink coffee every morning at 6. Linda took 2 quick steps toward them before they even reached the pump. "Officers," she said loudly, pointing directly at me across the concrete. "This man is refusing service to a member of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and attempting to extort payment after filling my vehicle." The word extort hung in the air like she had practiced saying it. Jensen looked at her. Then he looked at the pump display. Then his eyes moved slowly toward me. I was still leaning against the counter with the same blue shop rag in my hand. I could feel the heat rising off the pavement and hear the buzzing of the fluorescent lights behind me. For a moment nobody said anything. Linda broke the silence first. "Well," she demanded, "aren't you going to arrest him?" Jensen shifted his weight slightly and glanced at Torres. Then he looked back at me again, the corner of his mouth tightening like he was trying very hard not to smile. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we are going to need to understand exactly what happened here." Linda gestured toward the pump with a dramatic sweep of her arm. "What happened," she said, "is that he refused to honor a community agreement and is now trying to charge the homeowners association for gasoline that should have been provided as a courtesy." Jensen nodded slowly. His eyes flicked toward me one more time. Then he said the one sentence that made the entire situation pause for half a second. "Sir," he asked calmly, "would you like to explain?" The air at the station felt heavier after Officer Jensen asked the question. Not tense exactly, just quiet in that way a place gets when everyone is waiting for the next sentence. The diesel pickup driver had turned his engine off now, and somewhere behind the building an air compressor kicked on with a low mechanical hum. Linda Whitmore shifted her weight impatiently beside her Lexus, clearly expecting the story to be simple. I straightened up from the counter and folded the shop rag slowly in my hands. The cotton fabric still smelled faintly of motor oil and soap from the wash cycle earlier that morning. "Sure," I said calmly. "She pulled up about 10 minutes ago and filled her tank. $63.88. When the pump finished, she told me to charge it to the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I explained that we do not have an account like that here. We charge customers directly." Linda let out a sharp little laugh. "That is not what happened," she said quickly, stepping forward. "We have discussed this several times. Businesses in this town support the community. The Homeowners Association represents hundreds of residents." Officer Torres glanced briefly at the pump display again, then back toward me. Jensen remained still, listening. I continued speaking. In the same, even tone. I told her the same thing I tell everyone. If you pump gas, you pay for the gas. That is the policy. Linda waved her hand like she was brushing away something irritating. "He is being deliberately difficult," she said to the officers. "We had an understanding. The association provides value to local businesses. Exposure. Residents. Property development. He agreed to cooperate, and now he is refusing." That word again. Cooperate. It floated through the warm afternoon air like a slogan printed on a billboard. Jensen nodded slowly, his eyes moving between us. "Ma'am," he said carefully, Do you have any written agreement with this business regarding gasoline purchases? Linda hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the pause to be noticeable. Well, she said, it was discussed at a community outreach meeting. Torres tilted her head slightly. Was anything signed? Linda pressed her lips together. Not exactly signed, she admitted. But it was understood. I could hear the faint clicking of a car cooling somewhere behind the pumps. The sun had dipped a little lower now, casting long shadows across the concrete lot. Jensen looked back at me. Sir, he asked, are you refusing service to this customer? No, I said. I provided the service. Her tank is full. I am only asking for payment. Linda let out an exaggerated sigh. This is exactly the kind of attitude that hurts small towns, she said loudly, glancing toward the pickup driver like she was addressing an audience. The Homeowners Association spends thousands of dollars supporting local businesses every year. Jensen folded his hands near his belt and nodded again, absorbing the information. Then he looked at the pump number once more. $63.88. So to be clear, he said calmly, the dispute here is about payment for gasoline. It is about respect, Linda snapped immediately. It is about a business owner refusing to honor an agreement with the community. Jensen shifted his gaze toward me again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not confusion, recognition. A small detail had finally settled into place for him. Linda Whitmore, however, had not noticed it yet. She was too busy enjoying the moment, too convinced that the flashing lights beside her Lexus meant the next step would be someone putting handcuffs on the gas station owner who dared to tell her no. What she did not realize was that the story she had just told the officers had already answered the only question they really needed to ask. Officer Jensen let the silence sit for a moment after Linda finished speaking. The kind of silence that makes people start explaining more than they plan to. A faint breeze moved across the lot, rattling the loose edge of a plastic windshield cleaner bucket near pump 2. Linda shifted her stance again beside her Lexus, clearly expecting the next step to be quick and dramatic. She glanced at the officers, then at me, like someone waiting for applause after delivering a speech. So, she said, lifting her chin slightly, I assume you are going to handle this now. Jensen did not answer right away. Instead, he slowly looked at the pump display again, the glowing numbers still frozen at $63.88. Then he looked at the nozzle resting in its cradle, the hose hanging neatly along the side of the pump. Small details. The kind officers notice automatically. Officer Torres crossed her arms loosely and leaned a little closer to the cruiser door, studying the scene with the calm patience of someone who had handled 100 neighborhood disputes before lunch. Jensen turned his attention back to Linda. Ma'am, he said evenly, right now this appears to be a payment dispute between a customer and a business. Linda blinked, surprised by the wording. It is more than that, she said quickly. He is refusing to cooperate with the Homeowners Association. Jensen nodded slowly again, the same neutral expression still on his face. The Homeowners Association does not have authority over private businesses outside of its property, he said calmly. Linda's smile faded slightly at the edges. That is not correct, she insisted. The association represents the residents of Willow Creek Estates, and local businesses benefit from our presence. The diesel pickup driver near pump 2 shifted in his seat, clearly trying not to laugh out loud. Torres glanced briefly in his direction before looking back at Linda. Jensen took a slow breath through his nose, then spoke again in the same steady voice. Ma'am, unless there is a signed contract or evidence of theft, law enforcement cannot require a business to provide free goods. Linda's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed again with determination. But he is refusing service, she said. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. I provided the service. The gasoline is already in her vehicle. The words hung there in the warm afternoon air. Jensen nodded once more, as if confirming the obvious. Then the remaining issue is payment, he said. Linda looked from Jensen to Torres, clearly realizing the conversation was not moving in the direction she expected. So you are not going to arrest him? She asked sharply. Torres raised an eyebrow slightly, but did not answer. Jensen rested his hand lightly near his belt and spoke with the careful patience officers use when explaining something simple. Ma'am, we cannot arrest someone for asking a customer to pay for gasoline. Linda's face tightened, the confidence from a few minutes earlier draining away just enough to show frustration. She looked around the station again, noticing the quiet audience for the first time. The pickup driver, a minivan that had just pulled up near the air pump, a teenager inside the convenience store staring out through the glass door. For the first time since the cruisers arrived, the situation was not unfolding according to her script. But Linda Whitmore was not the kind of person who backed down easily. Instead, she straightened her blazer, stepped forward again, and pointed at me with the certainty of someone making one final move on a chessboard she thought she controlled. "Fine," she said sharply. "If he wants to play games, then I want a formal report filed. I want his name, his business license, and I want the police department to document this refusal." Jensen looked at her for a moment. Then he slowly turned his head toward me again, and this time there was no effort to hide the small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. Officer Jensen did not answer Linda right away. The small smile on his face lingered for a second, then disappeared as he shifted his attention back to her with the calm patience of someone who had handled situations like this many times before. The afternoon sun reflected faintly off the cruiser windshield behind him, and somewhere down the highway a semi-truck roared past, the sound rolling across the gas station lot like distant thunder. Linda Whitmore stood there with her arms folded tightly across her blazer, waiting for the officers to move, waiting for something official to happen that would confirm the version of events she had already written in her head. Jensen slowly reached toward the small notepad in his shirt pocket and flipped it open. The faint scratch of his pen against the paper sounded surprisingly loud in the quiet. "All right," he said evenly. "Let us start with your full name for the report." Linda relaxed slightly, clearly pleased the situation was finally turning into something formal. "Linda Whitmore," she said confidently, "President of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." Jensen nodded and wrote the name down carefully. "Address?" he asked. She provided the street name and house number with the same confident tone. Torres stood beside the cruiser listening quietly, her eyes occasionally drifting toward me and back to Jensen like she already understood where the conversation was headed. The pickup driver near pump 2 leaned back in his seat, arms resting on the window frame now, no longer pretending he was not listening. Jensen finished writing and looked up again. "And you are requesting a formal incident report regarding a business refusing to provide gasoline without payment." Linda corrected him immediately. "Refusing to honor a community agreement," she said firmly. Jensen nodded once more and wrote a few additional words on the page. Then he turned slightly and glanced at me again. There was that look again, the same subtle recognition that had appeared earlier. A quiet understanding passing between people who had worked together long enough to read each other without speaking. Torres noticed it too. The corner of her mouth twitched briefly before she cleared her throat and looked back toward Linda. Jensen closed the notepad halfway and asked the next question with careful neutrality. "Ma'am, when you called 911, what exactly did you report to dispatch?" Linda answered quickly. "I reported that a business owner was refusing service and attempting to extort payment from the Homeowners Association." Jensen tapped his pen lightly against the notepad. "Did you inform dispatch that gasoline had already been pumped into your vehicle?" Linda hesitated again, only for a fraction of a second. "That detail did not seem relevant at the time," she said. The pickup driver finally let out a quiet chuckle that he tried to hide behind his hand. Torres looked toward him briefly and then back at Linda with raised eyebrows. Jensen wrote another short note before closing the pad completely. For a moment he simply stood there, the warm air moving across the lot, the quiet hum of traffic continuing beyond the station canopy. Then he looked toward me again, this time more directly. The look was not subtle anymore. It was the look of an officer waiting for confirmation from someone who technically outranked him. Linda noticed the exchange immediately. Her eyes moved between us, suspicion beginning to replace the confidence she had carried into the parking lot. "Why do you keep looking at him?" she demanded. Jensen exhaled slowly through his nose and straightened his shoulders. "Because," he said calmly, "there is one small detail we should probably clarify before this report goes any further." Linda frowned. "What detail?" Jensen turned fully toward me now. "Sir," he said respectfully, "would you like to handle this explanation?" The station fell quiet again, the kind of quiet where even the buzzing fluorescent lights inside the office suddenly sounded louder than before. Linda Whitmore stared at me, waiting for the answer that she still believed would somehow prove she had been right all along. I could feel Linda Whitmore staring at me, waiting for the moment where everything would swing back in her favor. The late afternoon sun had dipped just enough that the edge of the canopy cast a long shadow across the pumps, and the faint hum of the soda cooler inside the station buzzed steadily behind me. Officer Jensen was still standing beside his cruiser, posture straight, the notepad tucked loosely in his hand. Officer Torres leaned lightly against the door with the quiet patience of someone who had already seen how this conversation would end. For a second, nobody moved. The pickup driver at pump 2 shifted again, the leather seat creaking softly as he leaned forward to watch. Linda cleared her throat and folded her arms tighter across her chest. "Well," she said sharply. "Go ahead. Explain." I looked down briefly at the folded shop rag still resting in my hands, then set it on the counter beside the register window. The fabric landed with a soft thump against the weathered wood. My boots scraped lightly against the concrete as I stepped forward from the counter into the open space near the pumps. The smell of gasoline lingered in the air, mixed with warm asphalt and the faint scent of motor oil drifting from the garage bay behind the station. I had worked around those smells my entire life. My father used to say you could tell a lot about a place by the way it smelled in the afternoon. This place smelled like 40 years of honest work. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out my wallet slowly. Linda watched the motion with a small satisfied smile, clearly assuming I was about to hand over some kind of identification she could use to file her complaint. Jensen watched too, but his expression was completely different now. Calm, almost amused. I flipped the wallet open and held it where the sunlight could catch the metal badge clipped inside. The polished surface reflected a sharp flash of gold across the concrete. Linda squinted slightly, trying to focus on the details. The words on the badge were small from where she stood, but Jensen and Torres could read them instantly. Both officers straightened without thinking, the kind of instinct that comes from years of habit. Jensen cleared his throat. "Chief Carter," he said respectfully. The title landed in the middle of the gas station like a dropped wrench on steel. Linda blinked once, then again, like the word had not registered properly the first time. I closed the wallet and slipped it back into my pocket. "Afternoon, Mark," I said calmly. Torres tried to hide a smile by turning her head slightly toward the cruiser window. Linda's mouth opened a little, then closed again. Her eyes moved from Jensen to Torres and finally back to me. The confidence that had filled her voice 10 minutes earlier was suddenly gone, replaced by the slow realization that something very important about this situation had changed. "Wait," she said uncertainly. "Chief." Jensen nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said politely. "Daniel Carter is the chief of police for this county." The words hung in the warm air under the canopy. Somewhere out on the highway a horn sounded as a truck passed, the noise fading quickly into the distance. Linda looked at me again, this time with a completely different expression. Confusion first, then disbelief. "But, you run a gas station," she said quietly. I shrugged slightly. "On weekends," I replied. The pickup driver finally laughed out loud, unable to hold it back any longer. Linda did not even glance in his direction. Her attention stayed locked on me as the reality of the last 10 minutes settled slowly into place. The police she had called, the report she demanded, the accusation she made. All of it had just landed directly on the desk of the person who ran the entire department. The laughter from the pickup truck faded quickly, leaving the station quiet again. Linda Whitmore still had not moved. Her eyes stayed fixed on me like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape in the middle of the game. The breeze shifted under the canopy, carrying the faint smell of gasoline and warm pavement across the pumps. Officer Jensen cleared his throat softly beside the cruiser, the same respectful posture still in place. Officer Torres stood straighter now too, no longer leaning on the door. Linda finally spoke again, but the sharp confidence from earlier had disappeared from her voice. "You are the police chief," she said slowly, as if repeating the words might make them less real. I nodded once. "That is correct." She blinked again and looked toward Jensen, searching his face for some kind of contradiction. He gave a small confirming nod. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier. 10 minutes ago, Linda Whitmore had been standing here calling for an arrest. Now the person she wanted arrested was technically the person responsible for the officers standing in front of her. She glanced briefly at the two patrol cars, the flashing lights still reflecting across the side of her Lexus. The red and blue colors no longer looked like backup. They looked like witnesses. Well, she said after a moment, straightening her blazer again, trying to gather what was left of her authority, that does not change the fact that you refused to honor a community agreement. The words came out slower now, like she was testing each one before letting it leave her mouth. I folded my arms loosely and leaned back against the counter again. Ma'am, I said calmly, there was no agreement. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jensen spoke first. Ms. Whitmore, he said carefully, based on what we have heard so far, this situation appears to be a misunderstanding about payment for gasoline. Linda looked at him sharply. It is not a misunderstanding, she insisted. It is a refusal to cooperate with the homeowners association. Torres shifted her weight slightly and crossed her arms. The homeowners association does not have authority to require free services from private businesses, she said evenly. Linda's eyes moved quickly between the two officers, and for the first time she seemed unsure what to say next. The pickup driver coughed quietly to hide another laugh. I glanced toward the pump again where the receipt paper still fluttered lightly in the breeze. $63.88. A simple number that had somehow turned into a full police response. Ms. Whitmore, I said, keeping my voice steady, you pumped gasoline into your vehicle. The pump recorded the amount. The station policy is the same for everyone. Customers pay for fuel. She stared at me for a long second, clearly realizing that the situation was no longer moving in the direction she wanted. The officers were not preparing an arrest. The report she demanded was not forming the way she imagined. And the person she had tried to pressure was not just a gas station owner after all. Jensen closed his notepad slowly and tucked it back into his shirt pocket. Ma'am, he said politely. At this point, the easiest way to resolve this situation is simply to pay for the gasoline. The words were calm, reasonable, and completely unavoidable. Linda Whitmore looked down at the pump display again, the glowing numbers reflecting faintly in the chrome trim of her SUV. For the first time since she stepped out of that Lexus, she was standing in a situation she could not control. The pump display glowed quietly under the canopy lights as Linda Whitmore stared at the number again. $63.88. The same number that had been sitting there the entire time, steady and patient while the situation around it spiraled into something far bigger than a simple purchase. The breeze shifted again, rattling the small stack of paper receipts beside the register window. No one spoke for a moment. Officer Jensen stood beside the cruiser with his hands resting lightly near his belt, posture calm, but unmistakably firm. Officer Torres watched Linda carefully, the expression on her face no longer amused, just professional. The pickup driver across the lot leaned back in his seat again, clearly enjoying the quiet suspense of the moment. Linda finally inhaled slowly, through her nose and lifted her chin again, trying to recover some of the authority she carried when she first arrived. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice quieter now, but still sharp around the edges. You are making a public scene over something the homeowners association should not even have to deal with. I did not move from the counter. No one is making a scene, I said calmly. You asked for police involvement. They came. Jensen nodded once in agreement. Linda opened her purse with a quick movement and began digging through it, the zipper teeth rattling softly. For a moment, it looked like she might continue arguing, but the longer the silence stretched, the clearer the situation became. 2 patrol cars. 2 officers. A pump display recording the exact amount of fuel in her tank. And the chief of the department standing 10 feet away watching the entire exchange unfold. She pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open with a frustrated motion. A credit card slid halfway out between her fingers. Fine, she said sharply. If that is what it takes to end this nonsense. She stepped toward the pump, swiped the card through the reader, and waited as the small screen processed the transaction. The machine beeped softly. Approved. The receipt printer hummed for a moment before spitting out a narrow strip of paper that fluttered lightly in the breeze. Linda snatched it from the slot before it could fall. The pickup driver clapped his hands together once, quietly, like someone acknowledging the final move of a chess match. Linda shot him a brief glare, but said nothing. Officer Torres exhaled slowly and uncrossed her arms. Jensen glanced at the pump display one more time before turning toward Linda. Thank you, ma'am, he said politely. That resolves the payment issue. Linda folded the receipt tightly in her hand, her knuckles whitening slightly around the paper. I will be discussing this with the association board, she said stiffly. Businesses in this town should understand who supports them. I shrugged slightly. Ma'am, people support businesses when they pay for the things they use. She did not answer. Instead, she turned toward her Lexus, opened the driver door, and slid into the seat with a sharp motion that made the suspension dip slightly under her weight. The engine started with a quiet purr. The flashing patrol lights reflected across the windshield one last time as she pulled slowly away from the pump and guided the SUV toward the station exit. No one stopped her. The tires rolled across the concrete and onto the highway entrance road before disappearing into the late afternoon traffic. The gas station grew quiet again as the sound of her engine faded into the distance. Jensen shook his head lightly and looked back at me with a faint smile. Torres glanced toward the highway as well before letting out a quiet breath. The whole situation had taken less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes for a $63 purchase that somehow turned into a lesson about how authority actually works in a small town. The sound of Linda Whitmore's Lexus faded down Highway 41 until it blended with the normal rhythm of late afternoon traffic. For a moment the station sat in that familiar quiet that always returned after something unusual passed through town. The fluorescent lights inside the office hummed softly, and the receipt printer near the register clicked once as the paper rolls settled back into place. Officer Jensen glanced toward the highway one last time before looking back at me with the kind of tired smile that comes from years of dealing with small-town drama. Well, he said, rubbing the back of his neck lightly. That is one call for the report log. Officer Torres let out a quiet breath and leaned against the cruiser again, her shoulders relaxing now that the situation was finished. The pickup driver across the lot finally stepped out of his truck and stretched his arms over his head like someone who had just finished watching a movie. Chief, he said with a grin, that might be the most expensive $63 I have ever seen someone argue over. I chuckled softly and picked up the shop rag from the counter again, folding it the way my father always used to. People argue about strange things, I said. Jensen shook his head slowly. I have responded to noise complaints, barking dogs, mailbox disputes, and once a call about someone parking 3 inches too close to a curb, he said. But I think this one might win the trophy. Torres laughed quietly and glanced around the station lot. The long shadows from the canopy stretched across the concrete now, reaching almost to the edge of the road. A sedan pulled into the far pump, its driver looking briefly at the cruisers before stepping out to start fueling like nothing unusual had happened at all. Small towns move on quickly once the excitement passes. Jensen adjusted his radio on his shoulder and nodded toward the pump where the numbers had finally reset back to 0. At least the situation ended the easy way, he said. No paperwork longer than it needs to be. I leaned back against the counter again and looked out toward the highway. The same road my father had watched for 40 years while running this place. He used to say that owning a gas station meant seeing every type of person eventually. Travelers, commuters, families, and sometimes someone who believed the world should bend just a little more for them than it did for everyone else. Torres pushed away from the cruiser and walked a few steps toward the pump, glancing at the receipt slot where the paper strip had been torn away. You know, she said thoughtfully. She probably thought calling the police would scare you. I shrugged lightly. That happens sometimes. Jensen smiled again. Except today she called the police and ended up arguing with the person who signs the department payroll. The pickup driver laughed again and climbed back into his truck, still shaking his head as he started the engine. The patrol lights switched off a moment later, leaving the station bathed in the soft orange glow of the evening sun. Jensen and Torres climbed back into their cruiser, the doors closing with 2 solid clicks. Before pulling away, Jensen lowered his window and looked toward me one last time. Chief, he said, next time you want a quiet afternoon, maybe close the station early. I smiled and shook my head. Where would the fun be in that? The cruiser rolled slowly out of the lot and merged onto the highway, disappearing into the same stream of traffic Linda had vanished into earlier. The station returned to normal after that. Just another evening of engines pulling in, pumps clicking on, and receipts fluttering in the warm breeze. Because in the end the lesson was not about $63 or a homeowners association argument. It was something simpler than that. Authority does not shout. Real authority simply stands there, waits patiently, and lets the truth speak for itself.